I think at this point we're slowly beginning to see my transition from being strictly a cartoon channel to being a whatever I feel like talking about channel. So knowing that, this video is leaning into that a little bit. I've wanted to start making at least some video game related content for a while now, but I never knew how to start. After all, there's only one video game video on this channel, and even that's debatable. But I felt strongly that some of the plants in Plants vs. Zombies were bad, and since my negative opinions get more views than the positive ones, why not use this as a chance to begin this new era on my channel? The only rule for this list is that I can only use plants from the first game on this list because I haven't played the other ones. So without further ado, let's get started. For number 10, I want to talk about sun cost. It is very important, especially when playing the main campaign. 75 sun for a supplemental plant is absurd. You place this plant on top of something else to make it work properly. In this case, you make it so that mushrooms can work during the day, which is an alright ability, but I only really find myself wanting to use it on gloom shrooms, because really, who's just clamoring to use a hypno shroom on the roof levels? Yeah, not many as I suspected. And so a cost of more than 25, let alone 3 times that, is too much to add for an ability that I'm already not crazy about. Lily pads don't cost 75, flower pots don't cost 75, and imitators don't add 75 to the cost of whatever plant they're imitating, so why should the coffee bean of all plants cost as much as it does? Sure, pumpkins cost 125, and you place them on top of other plants, but here's the thing, they have an ability I actually like to use. The gold magnet is the type of plant you use in special situations, but it actually doesn't help you beat the level in any way. At best you can say it's made for people who are too lazy to move their hand 1 inch to collect a coin. For how little it does and how long it takes to recharge, it's no wonder why few people use this unless they're trying to farm money. And even with that, you can just do the Zombaquarium glitch to farm money a lot faster. There's really no reason to use this in your main playthrough, or even survival mode, because it's not like they make money very common in those modes anyway. To actually get money in this game, you pretty much have to be farming it, and so that makes the gold magnet a worse plant that technically counts as an upgrade, quote-unquote, to the magnet shroom, which is far better on its own. For the umbrella leaf, you have to specifically want to use it to get any use out of it. It is actually useful in some situations, which is why it's so low on the list. When I say this plant is situational, I mean at best it's situational. Sure, bungees and catapults are annoying, but if you don't have umbrella leaves to deal with them, you can usually beat those levels. And for the very few situations where you want to use an umbrella leaf, that 100 sun cost does not help at all. And besides, there are other ways to deal with bungees and catapults that are more cost effective. Spikeweeds can effectively deal with catapults for basically the same cost, but they're actually worth the cost, because spikeweeds can't be eaten and they kill the catapult instantly before it can even damage your back row plants. And bungees can at least be slowed down by kernel pulse, which is actually one of the only good uses for a kernel pulse. If you're playing in a level with either a bungee or a catapult, it's in your best interest to use that slot in your inventory for something actually useful instead of wasting it on an umbrella leaf. I mentioned this one before when I talked about the coffee beans, so you knew it had to be on the list. This plan is pretty simple. It makes the zombie that eats it walk in the other direction and eat the zombies in its path. Obviously, since it's on the list, I have some problems with its design. For one, the recharge. You can't use these as often. Since it's a single-use plant, that makes a little sense, but for how many of these you need to stack for the effect to work properly, a slow recharge isn't ideal. Then there's the fact that for this to be effective, you can't use this in a lane with any damaging plants, because if you damage the zombie you're trying to hypnotize, that just makes him easier to kill. At best, you're looking at 1 or 2 zombies being killed in a lane where you pretty much can't attack. So yeah, it's a pretty terrible plant to actually use, and technically mushrooms aren't even plants anyway. That makes about as much sense as,
hey, if we're underwater, how could there be a...
I mentioned this earlier as a better alternative to the umbrella leaf, but that was really only one aspect. The butter this plant flings can stun bungee zombies long enough to make them killable, and since this thing actually does inflict damage, it is more than just a sitting duck like the umbrella leaf. But of all the plants that inflict damage, this has to be one of the worst. For the measly cost of 100 sun, you can choose to only inflict meaningful damage every once in a while. And since the times where you actually inflict meaningful damage are determined by RNG, this is a really unreliable plant to use during your playthroughs. For the same cost, you can get a pea shooter, and during the roof levels you have cabbage pults, so there's really no reason to use this over those two plants. Sure, the stun effect is nice, but there's no way to consistently get it to happen when you want it to, and honestly, I'd be okay with the higher sun cost or a slower recharge if they made that change. And since I know you're thinking about it, yes, if you plant two of these next to each other, you could plant a cob cannon on top. But to me, that's in a whole different league, and I don't necessarily count it in favor of the kernel pole. And since I put the gold magnet on here as its own entry instead of counting it against the magnet shroom, I think that's consistent and fair. I said Kernel Pult is one of the worst damage dealing plants in the game. Well, there's also this entry, and there's one more after it. The Starfruit is the second worst damage dealing plant in the game. In all practicality, it's a pea shooter that costs more sun. Sure, the Starfruit does shoot in 5 directions, but the other 4 are at such weird angles you almost never deal damage reliably unless the zombie walks directly in its path. 100 times out of 100, you're better off using a pea shooter. Or for that matter, a split pea, which costs the same and does the Starfruit's job 10 times better. There's really no reason to have so many shooting plants in the late game that are only worse versions of plants that already exist. I mean, Cactus isn't on the list because it helps with killing balloon zombies, although I almost put it on the list. But even then, I'd rather use a cactus than this thing because it serves some kind of purpose at least. At best, you could say the Starfruit is filler because they couldn't think of any other idea. And speaking of filler... yeah, the garlic is just a filler plant. There's pretty much no use for this thing in the main campaign. The only reason you'd want to use this thing is if you go for some kind of gimmicky setup. I dare say the only time I've seen this thing is used is in gimmicky setups, which shouldn't surprise you if you know what this plant is. The idea is to move zombies into other lanes when it eats this thing, and that's it. Garlic is a super supplemental plant whose only potential use could be early in the level where you try to use low-cost plants to build up a couple of rows of sunflowers and collect more sun to get more heavy-hitting plants. The problem is that the garlic is one of the only types of those plants that doesn't insta-kill. You're far better off using a squash or a potato mine in the early game instead of trying to play hot potato with the same zombie. And unless you're using this for some weird last stand or survival setup, there's almost no reason for this plant to be in your inventory. Alright, I'm sure you're heavily anticipating what the worst damaging plant in this game could be, and I think you'll be shocked to find that it's the three-peater. Because believe it or not, there's a way to get the exact same effect as this plant with a cheaper sun cost, and it's called... using 3 pea shooters. Like, if you're gonna make a plant that basically replaces not 1, not 2, but 3, why does it cost more than those 3 put together? Anytime you buy something in bulk, it costs less per unit. So why is a 3-peater suddenly worth more than if you planted 3 pea shooters individually? It makes no sense. And it especially makes no sense when you consider how the plant doesn't even work properly if you plant it on the top or bottom row. That means, on any non-pool level, you can only plant it in 3 rows if you want it to function properly. And sure, this plant has a fast recharge, but it effectively has a slow recharge due to how long it'll take you to recharge your sun supply if you want another one of these things. What a garbage plant. So I've mentioned how useful insta-kill plants like squash and potato mine can be, but here we have the worst insta-kill plant in the game, the chomper. The chomper's main gimmick is that unlike the squash and potato mine that disappear when used, the chomper stays, although it has to chew for a while and can't be used when it's chewing. But honestly, when you think about it, that's as good as disappearing in all practicality. For that amount of time, the chomper is basically a sitting duck That's basically as good as eating if you don't have pumpkins or tall nuts at that point in the campaign. But for the cost of a chomper, you can get 3 squashes, which you can put next to those tall nuts, and because of that, you're basically better off just using a squash. Because in most levels, they're short enough that at most you can only get to use a chomper 2 or 3 times anyway. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised at what I think the worst plant in the game is. It's most people's least favorite anyway. The marigold is basically a sunflower that spits out coins instead of sun, at about the same rate. And unlike the sunflower, the marigold has slow recharge for some reason. Because clearly if any plant needed a buff, it was this one. If you want coins, planting marigolds, especially in the campaign, is a horrible idea. You already get coins for beating certain levels, and by random chance you'll get money from killing zombies. And quite frankly, that's a far more efficient way of collecting money than using marigolds. I'll even give the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe you don't want to do the Zombaquarium glitch. Unless you just plant a ton of these in Last Stand, there's pretty much no reason to use these things in any situation. Thanks for watching, and have a good one, guys.